The Phoenix Suns owned the Minnesota Timberwolves during the regular season, going 3-0 in not-so-close games. On today's episode of Locked On Suns, how much of that was real for the Suns, and how much of it could we see Minnesota have answers for starting in Game 1 on Saturday? Let's go.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 7 seasons, a writer at Dime Magazine, the host of the Just Basketball Show, and I create written and video content for the Locked On Suns Insiders, which you can sign up for at the link in the show description below. Thank you so much for making Locked On Suns your first listen, Tuesday night into Wednesday morning. We are free and available everywhere, including YouTube, so just hit that follow or subscribe button. Get a new episode in your feed every single Monday through Friday. Become an everydayer. Get locked onto the Phoenix Suns all postseason long and beyond. Today's episode, guys, is brought to you by the Locked On Podcast Network. Go ahead and make Locked On NBA your first listen all playoffs long. Yes, there is a national show talking about all the things going on across the playoffs each and every day. You can sign up, follow, subscribe, and all your favorite podcast platforms there as well. Let's kick it off. I am excited. I am hyped for this series. We got a start time. I'm recording this at 8 p.m. on Tuesday night, Arizona time. So with the Lakers winning, we now know the Suns tip time, 12:30 on Saturday. What am I saying? Tuesday again for? And we have a lot to break down with this series. So I'm going to have Ben Beacon of Locked On Wolves on Thursday's show. I will have Stephen Perjone, our weekly guest here, to talk about all the things that need to happen for the Suns to win the series. That's how we'll wrap up. I'll make my prediction. I'll have Stephen make his on Friday. We'll have an episode Saturday evening after the game. And we're really in the sweet spot. We are having fun. That is what the postseason is about. Yeah, some stress as well, but all right. So the topic of the show today is going to be what we can learn from the dominance that the Suns had in the regular season, heading into the playoff series here against the Minnesota Timberwolves. And we're going to start with the Suns on offense. All right, because the thing is, outside of the 97-87 game, where the Suns still scored pretty well, especially in the first quarter, but largely that was more of a defensive game, the reason the Suns have been able to beat the Wolves this season, and what they will have to do to beat them again 4 times in 7 here, is exploit their defense. That is how Minnesota that's what makes them great. That is what gave them a chance at the 1 seed. That is their identity as a team. They are one of the best defensive teams in the entire NBA. The best, I should say. And with Rudy Gobert, Jaden McDaniels, even a bench player like Nickeil Alexander-Walker, the majority of the guys that they put on the court are defensive difference makers. I would even go so far as to say first and foremost, that's what they're out there to do. And their offense comes from 2 star players, which we'll get to. So when I think about the Suns on offense, which means the Wolves on defense, of course, the first thing I think about is Karl-Anthony Towns. The first player I think about is Karl-Anthony Towns, because obviously he missed the 97-87 win a couple weeks ago. He came back on Sunday when the Suns were able to beat them and clinch that 6th seed, but he was in only his 2nd game back. And all the way back in November, the matchups and the personnel and everything was very skewed because Devin Booker did not play in that game, right? So what will we see Towns do? In the game on Sunday, he guarded Grayson Allen, which is the same thing that his replacement, Naz Reid, did in the game a couple weeks back. So when I'm thinking of the Suns on offense, my question is, does that continue? Or can the Wolves make better use of him, right? Because I thought the Suns did an incredible job identifying that was the matchup on Sunday, and in that other game when it was Naz Reid, and manipulating it, right? So you saw them run Grayson Allen off of screens. You saw them utilize Grayson Allen as a screener. You saw Grayson Allen operate with the ball in his hands, oftentimes in transition or semi-transition early offense situations, all making Karl-Anthony Towns either navigate screens or defend in space. So that's obviously a problem, but is there a solution to it, right? So I think that's one of the things that will decide this series. I think us not seeing the Minnesota Timberwolves adjust off of that really makes it hard to say whether it will translate from the regular season we saw into the playoffs, but they may not have another choice, right? I think what we will see, though, is maybe as soon as the tip-off first possession of Game 1 on Saturday, we will see Towns defend Durant. I just feel like that's the best solution. He cannot guard Booker or Beal as a primary matchup. If he were to guard Nurkic, well, it's not like Denver, right? Where that's what Minnesota did, and we'll close out talking about that series in this episode here. Well, Gobert can't guard a guy like Aaron Gordon. The Suns don't have an Aaron Gordon, a non-shooter, paint-dwelling, secondary role player on offense. No, the guy Gobert would have to hide on would be the same thing we're already talking about with Cat. It would have to be Allen or Durant, and it's even less tenable for Gobert to be doing that. So that's where I land. I don't think Allen is I don't think it's going to work. And it also prevents Cat from being able to be a helper, right? And that's where I think he actually can do some damage, which leads us to the next thing, okay? Thinking about the Suns on offense, thinking about what can translate from their success against the Wolves in the regular season over to the playoffs. The second thing that comes to mind is Jusuf Nurkic versus Rudy Gobert. Now, it might sound stupid or crazy to say that anybody against the likely defensive player of the year, a multiple-time defensive player of the year, is an advantage. I'm not exactly saying it's an advantage. I think Gobert is better than Nurkic. I think that if you're talking about some of the occasions where we saw Nurk try to score on Gobert, it did not always go well, and that's not going to change, okay? However, I think the way that Nurkic plays and the way that the Suns use him, does it make Gobert 10%, 15% less impactful? Maybe. Maybe it's just 5%, but that goes a long way, right? And I just think it'll continue because, for instance, right, we see Nurkic utilized a lot by the Suns as a perimeter playmaker, whether that's in a dribble handoff situation, whether that is in sort of a high post, pinch post, elbow, type of spot where he's passing to cutters, ball reversal, whatever the case may be. That just pulls Gobert out of the paint, period, right? The further out you place Nurk in those playmaking spots, well, Gobert has to come out and handle that to keep Nurkic honest. That's kind of why I do think those moments where he did look to score on Gobert still matter. You got to keep him honest. You got to show that you're going to try it. And some of those also happen in the pick and roll. And that's the other way where I think that Nurkic as an addition, as a sidekick to this big three is important, right? Because the obvious thing a lot of people are going to talk about that maybe I should have gotten out of the way earlier is the Suns' ability to take and make pull-up jumpers means that Rudy Gobert's preferred method of playing defense, where he drops in around the free throw line when he's defending the pick and roll to wall off the paint, to take away the drive from the ball handler, to kind of defend two guys at once, keeping the track of the roll man while also getting a hand in the face of that ball handler. That dance is not really possible for long stretches if Durant, Booker, Beal are comfortable coming off of that screen, pulling up from three, pulling up from the mid-range, even making floaters at times. So you're going to see Minnesota utilize Gobert a little differently. And Nurkic's ability, when he's the screener and Gobert maybe instead of dropping comes out to the level of the screen and tries to, hedge against that ball handler turning the corner, or maybe, although I don't think we're going to see this much, they blitz with Gobert. Whatever other situations like that, that obviously opens up the pocket pass on the short roll to Jusuf Nurkic, catch downhill, spray out to a shooter, or score, right? And Nurkic can do that. He's one of the best bigs in the NBA at doing that. And so if the big three are making it hard for Gobert to drop, and Nurkic is putting pressure on the Wolves defense when they have Gobert play a more aggressive coverage, you're running out of options. And so Nurkic is a big answer. And so minutes when he's not on the court, I think will be hard, maybe harder for the Suns to score. And obviously his own defense is going to be important too against the pick and roll, but we'll get there in a second. The last thing, Mike Conley is very small. The Suns don't have a guy as small as him. So he has to guard, if we're switching up the matchups, likely he has to guard Grayson Allen. Grayson Allen can drive through Mike Conley, attacking a closeout. He can attack him in transition. Allen has a little bit of power to his game as a driver, as a downhill scorer that we've seen him display. And so Conley being so much smaller, where in other matchups when he gets to maybe guard a Kentavious Caldwell-Pope against Denver, for instance, or, you imagine him guarding the Mavs and he gets to go against Kyrie, who's similar size. That's not the case. So that's another thing that I think ports over. I just think the Suns' offense is really tough guard for Minnesota, and that's not changing. The other end, I think, could change. We'll go to when the Suns are on defense coming up next. First, today's show brought to you by Nissan. Are you the kind of driver that likes to push things a little further? Have you ever wondered what adventure could be around your next corner? Well, our friends at Nissan have a lineup of SUVs with the capability to take your adventure to the next level. 2024 Nissan Rogue, perfect for city drives and great escapes. With class-exclusive Google built in, your always updating assistant is there to call on for almost anything. Gone are the days of connecting your phone. Google Assistant, Google Maps, and Google Play Store are built right into the 12.3-inch HD touchscreen infotainment system, all combining to make the 2024 Rogue the perfect midsize crossover for your next adventure. Nissan's incredible lineup also includes the 2024 Pathfinder, which has room for up to 8, an expansive cargo capacity, and advanced 4x4 capability. With 284 horsepower and up to 6,000 pounds towing, when adventure calls, the Pathfinder is there to answer. Take the Nissan Rogue, Nissan Pathfinder, or Nissan Armada and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. Today's show also brought to you by Monopoly Go. I love Monopoly, and I have a competitive side. And my competitive side is a big fan of Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it. Downloaded over 150 million times. It's a great twist on Monopoly where you're playing on not one, but hundreds of Monopoly boards in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. But the best part is messing with your friends. Charge them rent on your iconic properties, just like classic Monopoly. Rob their vaults of riches for yourself. And brag with the leaderboards, showing who the biggest Monopoly tycoon is. But it's not just my competitive side that loves it. You can team up with friends and people all around the world in time tournaments and stack your pockets a little bit potentially as well. So get in the game, join your friends, download Monopoly Go free on the App Store or Google Play today. Keeping the show rolling. Don't forget to sign up for the Locked On Suns Insiders, where you get my first reaction to all Suns news, exclusive game day content and observations, halftime and post-game, as well as video breakdowns of one quarter of each game with a watch back, plus one-on-one conversations with me via text message. You can respond, ask questions, do all of that stuff. Excited for you to be a part of the Locked On Suns Insiders. So join the Locked On Suns Insiders now. Be in the know about the Suns all the time. Click the link in the show description below or visit joinsubtext.com/Locked On Suns. I am going to do a watch back on Friday, so you have all week to sign up. And at that point, I will be going back through the first quarter of Sunday's game between the Suns and Wolves to walk you through a lot of what we're talking about, getting ready for the series and how the Suns match up with Minnesota. So I'm going to plug this every day. You're going to want to sign up down the stretch of the postseason, and I will have that video for everybody who takes advantage up until then. I will send out that video on Friday. So sign up before Friday to get the Suns' first quarter watch back against Minnesota from game 82. All right. When the Suns are on defense, all right, I said, and I believe it, that, all right, Minnesota's offense was 16th in the NBA this season. Mediocre. It's a big reason why, no matter whether they played the Suns or not, I was not going to be a big believer in the Wolves as a, championship contender. That said, I don't think it's going to be as ugly as the regular season would indicate. I think the Wolves have some answers here, some buttons they can push, so to speak, that will make them be able to score a little better, right? In the 3 games that these teams have played, Minnesota scored 115, 87, and 106. Not ugly, right? Again, it was really their defense that broke down and prevented them from making a game out of those 3 matchups. So, the first thing, it's pretty basic what the Suns have done, right? They've been helping off of shooters to crowd Anthony Edwards' driving lanes. Now, some of that, like the attention is going to be put on Ant, right? Because, and it's going to be very familiar to Suns fans. We've seen Booker go through a lot of these growing pains with the ball in his hands. You show him help, you disguise that help, you maybe mix up coverages, but generally you want to, put bodies between him and the basket as much as possible. And a lot of those things Suns fans are going to recognize as what Book had to deal with in his postseasons. But to me, it's actually just as much about help the shooters on the court, or the lack thereof for Minnesota, as it is Ant's own struggles or growing pains, right? So, for instance, I think Kyle Anderson is unplayable in this series. I think he might be unplayable in the playoffs, period. He was a huge part of their offense last season. He made his threes at a decent clip. He was basically a point guard for them. He's been just cannot score. Athleticism, obviously, has always not really been there for him. And because he can't shoot well, you gotta make some hard decisions. So there's one off the bat. I think Mike Conley, as an example, is going to need to be more aggressive. He's going to need to come into this series thinking the ball is largely going to be in Ant's hands, and not always, There's some things, like a Conley-Gobert pick and roll. Maybe you can try to, punish Nurkic a little bit, get some lobs to Gobert going, things like that. We'll get to that in a moment. But largely, okay, the ball's going to be in Ant's hands. If I'm Chris Finch, the head coach, what shooters can I play around that? How can I space guys better? And what mentality do I need to tell my guys to have, right? So I think some of it will the spacing can get a little bit better. I even think about and this feels like something the Wolves don't do often enough, but I could see it in this series, especially with a relatively smaller player in KD guarding Cat most of the time, right? An Ant-Cat pick and roll with Gobert in the dunker spot along the baseline. Now, you can switch that, right? But I think I trust Ant to attack Durant, even though Durant's had a pretty strong defensive season at times, throughout stretches of the year. And I think Cat could score on Beal in the post, right? So I think we could see some of that. There are answers. But that brings us to Gobert, who I just mentioned. The way that the Suns have kind of guarded him is in the pick and roll, largely when Ant is handling the ball, as one way that they've showed a crowd against his drives is to have Nurkic step up, not a blitz or a hedge all the way out on the perimeter, but a more shallow drop and less of a recovery back to Gobert as the play gets closer to the basket, right? So Ant drives, Gobert's rolling. Instead of what we would normally see, which is when the point of attack defender recovers back to the ball handler, you see the big kind of retreat. Nurkic hasn't really done that. He's let up that lob. They're daring Ant to make that pass, sometimes Conley, who's better at it. And if the Wolves are more ready for that, I think we will see them go after it more. In the game on Sunday, they went to Gobert, but a lot of that honestly was more of a traditional, just a roll. Nurkic was in position a lot of the time, but just couldn't do much. He has a little bit of I think he might be an inch or two shorter than Gobert, wingspan, athleticism, disadvantage, everything else. Gobert can finish, but I think they can look for it even earlier on and not always when Gobert finally has like a post position, but just straight up on that roll. Another thing, Suns on defense, Minnesota personnel. I talked about Kyle Anderson. I think you're going to see more Nickeil Alexander-Walker in this series than maybe you did in the regular season because he can guard Booker and Beal while also being a guy who's more aggressive as a shooter. So play more of him, less of Anderson, maybe even less of Conley. And then turnovers, right? I don't see a reason why Minnesota, unless Ant really just does not solve this whole coverage that he's seeing, I think they averaged 16 per game in the regular season against the Suns, third worst against any opponent that they faced. They're not an amazing taking care of the ball team, but they're not that bad. I would expect that number to go down. I don't think it'll be so ugly. I think Towns being in there, being a more reliable option to dump it off to late in the clock, not having to force it all the time from Ant's perspective, all these things will kind of add up. And I would expect that number to go down. So there's going to be these little ticks up. I would expect the Wolves to more routinely break 100, at least be able to make this a game on offense if their defense can rediscover its form, which, as I said, a little less optimistic about. All right, moving on. What does last year's Denver series teach us about this year's series where the Suns face Minnesota? We'll dive into what I saw looking back at some of the stats and video from that series next. First, today's show brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay's Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Closing out the show, Suns-Wolves, Saturday. This is the second go-around for this group. Really third, right? I mean, Minnesota had a play-in opportunity 3 years ago. Well, 2 years ago, 3 postseasons ago. They lose 5-1 against Denver in the first round in 2023, and now here they are, 3 seed, huge regular season, and they get another shot at it. So, they have the chemistry advantage. They have the experience advantage in terms of playing together in this environment. Will that matter? Well, I think it will in terms of maybe some confidence. They also have home court advantage, but part of what's not fully telling the whole story about putting it the way that I just did is last season, you might remember, Jaden McDaniels got a little frustrated, punched a cushion as what he thought it was, ended up being a wall with a cloth over it, a hanging, net or something. Missed the series. Naz Reid was hurt last year. Actually got hurt in Phoenix, if you remember, toward the end of the regular season last year. And those guys are both a huge part of what the Wolves are going to do, right? So last season, you're talking about starting Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who was beyond unproven. This year, he was a more regular part of the rotation. Last year, not so much. And a worse version of Karl-Anthony Towns, who was also coming back from injury, but a far more significant one, almost a torn Achilles last year. And so the whole thing was very different. I think the Wolves will be much better, much more competitive this year. I think even Gobert, frankly, did not have his best season last year and has had a much better year this year. The chemistry between Cat and Gobert, the way that they use those guys to their benefit rather than, watching Towns struggle like he did often last season. All of that to me has to give you some optimism that this series will be more competitive. So does that mean it goes 6-7? Does that mean the Wolves win? We'll see. We don't know. I can't tell you the answer to that. Otherwise, we wouldn't have to play the series out. But one thing I think will translate over from that series last year is Anthony Edwards solving defenses, all right? And I talked about it from a Suns perspective, but look, even that aggressive, clogging the paint, having the big kind of step up, all those things, I'm not even convinced that's not what we're going to see the Suns do for 7 straight games. That would be dumb of them, even if Ant kept struggling against it, frankly. Like, you're tempting fate if you show a great player the same thing repeatedly and expect him not to eventually solve it. So that won't even be exactly what happens all the way through. But regardless, I expect Ant to figure it out, right? Again, we're talking about last year, a restricted version of Towns, less shooting, less offensive talent around him, and yet Ant averaged against Denver in the first round 32-5-5 on 48% shooting. A lot of those games were close. The Wolves got blown out in game 1, but the final 4 games were basically all close. They obviously win one of them. And basically the only thing Ant struggled with was, continues to be a relatively high turnover guy. That's part of the package for a young playmaker. But his threes didn't go in at an elite rate, and that kind of pulled his shooting percentage down. But, you're talking about playoff series number 1, still on his rookie contract, 32-5-5. This guy's legit. Bradley Beal is maybe, you could even make the case, Beal is a better option against Edwards than even anything the Suns had last year to guard Russ or Murray or whatever. We were talking about, Landry Shamet and Devin Booker having to overtax himself. Beal will be a good option, but he's not going to stop Ant, all right? Ant is going to show up, and I think the Suns are prepared for that. They don't think they've solved him, and I don't think we should either. Here's the other thing. Big picture that we saw in that Wolves series, or that Nuggets series, sorry. Minnesota was outscored by 23 across the 5 fourth quarters that were played. Now, in one game, they got outscored in the fourth quarter and then came back to win in overtime. So that's a little, you could cut that, slice that in multiple different ways. But point is, routinely, Denver, as they did to everybody, including the Suns and the Heat in the finals and everything else, they pulled away in the fourth. Number one, the Suns are not the type of fourth quarter team to punish Minnesota that way. Number two, I don't expect the Wolves to struggle that much with an extra year of experience, an extra year of development for their young guys, better health, etc., etc. So I think what we might have to see from the Suns is jumping on these guys early, right? Maybe that comes by way of, a hot scorer, which we know the Suns are going to probably get most nights from at least one of their big 3, or even Allen. Maybe that is, jumping out to a quick lead by way of confusing, flummoxing Anthony Edwards with the defensive scheme, forcing some turnovers like we've seen the Suns do against the Wolves, even if that doesn't maybe soar to the 16 per game that we saw in the regular season. Because Minnesota's not a team built to come back. They don't have the offensive firepower to necessarily do that. They maybe have shown themselves to be a little susceptible in these late game situations, although I think they've been better this year. And the Suns themselves probably want to have that cushion, given what I just said about their own problems. So that's interesting. That's a big change from how Denver hurts you versus how the Suns hurt you. And it's one of the reasons, you play the series. It's one of the reasons the matchups are interesting and fun and a big part of why teams succeed or fail. So that's a little bit of what I think we can learn. I think largely it's going to be a whole new ball game compared to the Nuggets. The Suns are not the same team. And even in a lot of ways, a difference from the 3 games that the Suns played against this team in the regular season. That'll wrap us up. Back tomorrow with Ben Beacon of Locked On Wolves for a crossover preview. I'll ask him some questions. He'll ask me some questions. Don't forget to sign up for the Locked On Suns Insiders at joinsubtext.com or at the link in the show description below to get that watch back of quarter number 1 from Sunday's game, to prep you for Game 1 on Saturday. I'll give you all week to sign up. Don't miss it. I'll have that video for you Friday. Hit follow or subscribe to get all of those episodes all week in your feed. And I will catch you guys tomorrow.